Welcome to this second panel. I'm Jeremy Edwards, Head of Nuclear Security Strategy at the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory. So we now move on to our second panel of the day, titled Safety, Security and Innovation in Civil Nuclear Energy. I think, interesting topic and builds nicely off the first session. The security, non-proliferation and geopolitical challenges in civil nuclear are increasingly converging with some of the key and traditional themes of PONI in terms of defence, deterrence and nuclear capability. Joseph, in his keynote, spoke to the Defence Command paper, providing that demand signal to the defence nuclear enterprise, which has really sort of corralled efforts and given a key focus towards the need to refresh and provide that UK nuclear deterrent. I guess the analogy in civil nuclear at COP26, the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, was where world leaders came together and committed to achieve net zero by 2050, effectively opening the door for nuclear to play its part in the global supply of clean energy. For many nations, nuclear energy already performs a key part of their energy strategy. And the UK itself, in the Energy Roadmap, which was published earlier this year, has committed to 24 gigawatts electric, representing about 25% of projected UK demand, to come purely from nuclear technologies. But for many nations, nuclear has been prohibitively expensive. Innovation and adoption in modern manufacturing methods and modularisation, the factory build of reactors addresses, some of those key barriers, one being cost, new reactors potentially an order of magnitude cheaper, and a sort of handful of years, 3 rather than sort of 15-year construction timeline, suddenly has made nuclear and civil nuclear much more attractive. Consequently, the forecast for expansion in nuclear energy is huge, generating a vibrant sector, with many states and commercial vendors seeking to capitalise on innovation technologies and novel applications of technology, such as floating nuclear power plants for regions where the geology or the available land mass may not be able to accommodate conventional nuclear power plants. Our next 3 speakers will seek to explore some of these innovations and some of the complex issues with talks on space propulsion, the geopolitics of energy supply and state involvement in that, and the siting of small modular reactors. Like the first panel, our 3 speakers will present in turn, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A session, which will be off the record. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Callum McLoughlin, graduated from Heriot-Watt University with a Master's in Chemical Engineering and joined AWE, the Atomic Weapons Establishment Nuclear Security Technologies Group in 2023. His interest in space exploration has motivated him to pursue this morning's presentation here at PONI, delving into the opportunities for the UK of nuclear propulsion in space, and it's a path to innovation and economic growth for the United Kingdom. I'd like to welcome Callum to the lecture.
Good morning. So at its closest point, Mars is about 34 million miles away, and if you were to drive there non-stop, it would take you about 50 years. My name's Callum McLoughlin, and I'd like to talk about a technology that could reduce that to just a few months. So I want to discuss nuclear propulsion today. So I want to discuss the technology, the strengths and the challenges that come with it, and the opportunity it has to drive forward advancement, and innovation and economic growth for the UK. I'm going to touch upon the areas of the UK that we can leverage our nuclear skills and leverage them into space exploration and the subsequent advantages that it could generate for us. So what is nuclear propulsion? So this uses fission reactions, generally of uranium compounds, to generate power and propel spacecraft. Whilst Nuclear has been used before in space. It's been through RTGs, so radioisotope thermoelectric generators, for example, in the Voyager missions. So they make use of the heat from the decaying of radioisotopes to power the electricity for the vehicles. This nuclear propulsion has never been tested in orbit outside of the Earth's atmosphere. The nuclear propulsion systems will also work in combination with traditional chemical rockets, since chemical rockets are more suitable for the launching and landing situations in the Earth's atmosphere. There are two versions of nuclear propulsion, so nuclear thermal propulsion, NTP, and nuclear electric propulsion, NEP. So nuclear thermal propulsion uses the nuclear reactor to heat up a propellant, typically hydrogen. So it's heated to extremely high temperatures, which then expands rapidly and is expelled through the nozzle, generating the thrust. This method provides higher propulsion efficiency than chemical rockets, meaning longer missions with less fuel. NTP is ideally suited to crewed or manned missions to Mars or rapid transport between the Earth and lunar surface. Nuclear electric propulsion, on the other hand, uses the nuclear reaction to generate electricity, which powers ion thrusters. This is a more gradual propulsion, although highly efficient, and leads to prolonged acceleration. These characteristics make it ideally suited to long-duration deep space missions, such as distant moons or dwarf planets. Hopefully you can see that the two similar propulsion methods both have their own space and specific missions that they'd be suited for. So why should we be interested in nuclear propulsion over traditional chemical rockets or purely electric or even solar-powered options? And that's because it provides much faster travel to distant destinations. For example, a traditional rocket in their trip to Mars would take about 9 months, and this technology reduced that to 3 to 4 months. This need for faster travel is really born out of the need to reduce the exposure for astronauts or crewed missions in space, space radiation, and the other inherent space risks. Nuclear propulsion systems are also much more efficient than the other chemical methods, which means they can carry heavier payloads. NTP has twice the specific impulse, which is a measure of the propulsion efficiency, meaning it can achieve greater thrust with less fuel. As mentioned, the nuclear propulsion can shorten the distance, the time for travel to faraway planets. So for travel to Jupiter and Saturn, it makes it more realistic for a human lifespan. And as I mentioned, the increase in efficiency is also great for reducing the overall cost of space travel, making it more economically viable in the long term. So where is the UK currently positioned within the space industry? You're probably aware we're most active in the small satellite space, so CubeSats, and also in the space launch capabilities. However, in 2021, there was the UK National Space Strategy published, which made reference to improving and developing our work in nuclear space power and propulsion. So this was backed up by funding of initially 2.9 million to Rolls-Royce, followed up this year with an additional 4.8 million. I'm aware some members of the room here will have much more experience and be better positioned to talk about the technology and timelines, but I'm just using it as a concrete example of a good first step that the government's taken in harnessing the expertise we currently have and applying it to the problem that, or the opportunity that is space-based travel. Get the next slide. Yeah, so who else is interested in nuclear propulsion? Somewhat unsurprisingly, the US are pioneers in this area. Back in the 60s, they proved the first feasibility of nuclear thermal propulsion with the NERVA program. So this was proven in the Earth's atmosphere. It was never launched orbitally, never operational, and was cancelled in 1973 due to budget restrictions. But more recently, NASA's been working with DARPA on the Draco program, so that stands for the Demonstration Rocket for Agile Cislunar Operations. And this is a nuclear thermal propulsion system scheduled for demonstration in space in just 3 years' time. What I found most interesting with this design is that it's based around low enriched uranium, which would be an excellent choice for the UK to take forward. As we mentioned earlier, the nuclear roadmap, one of the core pillars is the use of HALEU technology and low-enriched uranium. So bringing this forward into the nuclear propulsion space could lead to greater efficiencies in the overall supply chain, the skills development and the recycling of the material in the overall UK structure. As you can see there, Russia and China are also involved, with news coming out that Russia's Zeus program was cancelled this year due to lack of funding. And as we've touched on before, China is trying to catch up. I think this goes to show that the other nuclear powers around the world are taking this seriously. They're investing their resources and time into it, and we shouldn't be left behind. We need to have a seat at the table if this technology proves successful. So it wouldn't just be a scientific breakthrough. Successful adoption of the technology would lead to significant economic opportunities for the UK. The development, deployment of the nuclear propulsion systems would stimulate considerable growth in initially the aerospace and nuclear sectors. So it includes directly impacting highly skilled labour in engineering and research, but the broader stimulation would have knock-on effects into areas such as materials science and advanced manufacturing. By spearheading this endeavour into nuclear propulsion technology, the UK could position itself as a hub for international partnerships and collaboration efforts moving forward. So when we talk about innovation, we also need to appreciate the long-term benefits that come with the investment and the knock-on industries that it could and probably will produce. So these are a list of examples of technology that was either invented or rapidly improved during the space race of the 1960s. So as you can see, what was cutting-edge technology is now everyday occurrences in our lives, like GPS and solar panels. This kind of goes to show that we don't really know how much of the advantages we could gain from this aggressive innovation in the market. We have no idea in 50 or 60 years' time how many industries could sprout up because of it. So obviously with this sort of new technology there comes many challenges. First and foremost would be the cost. So we can expect this to be depending on the level of engagement, in the hundreds of millions or billions of pounds. That would obviously need to be assessed against other priorities for the UK. And as with all nuclear projects, safety is a massive aspect, and mitigating the risks that come along with it. Straight away, some of these risks include the exposure of the crew from the reactors on the shuttles or vehicles, and also the potential impact of a large spreading of the nuclear material in case of an accident in the launching or landing stages, which have a knock-on effect to the environmental concerns. Technical challenges still being worked on and operated on include the final design of the reactors and also the materials that would be used in the environment. So it would be operating in temperatures in excess of 2,500 degrees Celsius, so there's something to be worked on in that area. Alongside this, any development would need to be negotiated with international treaties, such as the International Space Treaty, and also needs to be accepted into the realm of public opinion, which I'm sure you understand is a difficult one to navigate. So in order to overcome these challenges and to seize these opportunities, the UK must show commitment to the previously established but maybe not fully fleshed out government strategy on the matter. So this can be done through prioritising the support and funding, such as investing in infrastructure, as it has shown it's willing to do, and applying for funding for grants and incentives moving forward. It also will be essential to nurture collaborations, such as obviously with the public, but also with academia, with private bodies, and with overseas governments and organisations. This will ensure the sharing of knowledge and best practices that will expedite the technological advancement in the area. So just to conclude, the nuclear propulsion represents a transformative opportunity for the UK space industry and economic growth. If we can embrace this cutting-edge technology, the potential economic benefits are substantial, from job creation and industry growth to international investment and collaboration. I hope you can see that nuclear propulsion is a great opportunity for us going forward in the future. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Callum. Now, introduce our second speaker of panel 2, Mackenzie Schuessler, who's a program coordinator on the nuclear policy program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So a number of roles previously, including a staff assistant at the United States House of Representatives. In 2019, Mackenzie completed her undergraduate education with dual degrees in political science, international studies, and then also a minor in Middle Eastern religious studies. So, welcome.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. I'm so excited to be here. I feel like I've learned so much already this morning, and I'm excited for the afternoon. As Jeremy said, my name is Mackenzie Schuessler. I'm based in Washington, D.C., where I'm working towards my master's degree in international security at George Mason University, and I'm also with the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As you can see by my title, we're going to be talking about small modular reactors and some of the existing international legal frameworks that we use to ensure safe and secure nuclear reactor operations. A little bit of context. Throughout history, humanity has shaped our planet in profound ways. Just in the last 240 years since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we've seen exponential increases in manufacturing capability, steam power, mechanization, and along with that, an extreme growth in human population. As our population has grown, so has our demand for energy. Historically, we've relied on fossil fuels for this industrialization and urbanization. However, as we see, are facing some dire consequences as a result of those fuels. As such, states all over the world today are reconsidering nuclear power as a green and reliable energy source. A few examples of this renewed interest: COP28, 27 countries pledged to triple nuclear energy generation by 2050. Similarly, 34 world leaders at the 2024 Nuclear Energy Summit in Belgium declared that they would work to unlock the potential for nuclear energy. According to the World Nuclear Association, 30 states are actively pursuing nuclear power programs, and an additional 20 have expressed interest at some point in time. Historically, conventional large nuclear power plants have a very high barrier to entry, as Jeremy mentioned in his opening remarks. High costs, licensing and regulatory complications and processes, construction delays, they've all discouraged stakeholders from pursuing these large projects. It's very hard to get this started and completed. These challenges have led policymakers and industry alike to look toward advanced nuclear technology, specifically SMRs, as a cost-effective and more easily deployable way to increase nuclear power capacity. So what is an SMR? An SMR is considered Generation 4 advanced nuclear technology. As the name suggests, it is small, generating under 300 megawatts electric, and modular, meaning that these reactor components and systems can be fabricated in factories, transported to the sites, and assembled on site. Microreactors are another kind of SMR. They're even smaller and will be compact enough to be transported on trucks, as illustrated here in this illustration. Some of the SMR designs today use the same processes as large conventional nuclear reactors being cooled by water. Other SMR designs use new materials such as liquid metals, gases, or molten salts as coolants. SMRs offer several potential advantages compared to conventional large nuclear reactors. These new coolants and fuel types may offer inherent safety advantages such as higher heat capacities and higher retention of radioactive material. Given their smaller size and need for less nuclear material, SMRs will have a much smaller footprint and require less frequent refueling. Furthermore, traditional reactor safety systems are considered active, meaning that they require human intervention. SMRs, on the other hand, will employ passive safety and security systems. Reactors with these systems will have the ability to self-regulate and provide sufficient cooling in the event of an electricity outage. SMR developers argue that factory fabrication, simpler design systems, and smaller overall size will result in a reduction of capital and operational costs, and construction and deployment timelines will also be shorter. Ideally, these advantages will help SMRs overcome some of the largest barriers faced by conventional large plants, and these SMRs can also be used in new locations and for new use cases. For example, new locations. SMRs can be put in a lot of places that are currently unavailable to large reactors. So newcomer countries with smaller electric grids, at remote locations or at military bases, as transportable or floating power plants, or closer to urban centers and dense populations. SMRs can also provide services other than electricity, including seawater desalination, hydrogen production, district heating, and industrial applications. The AI field right now is really interested in using small modular reactors to power their data centers, as we're seeing a lot of traction on this in Virginia right now. So considering these new possibilities, I think it's really necessary to understand how our existing legal mechanisms apply to SMRs and how we can govern nuclear reactor security, safety, emergency preparedness and response, and liability. So I'll go through these pretty briefly, but this is our current framework of international laws and treaties that relate specifically to nuclear accidents. Non-proliferation is very important in this regard, but I didn't have the time to talk about that as well. So first, the CPPNM and its 2005 amendment both protect nuclear material and international and domestic transport, storage, and use, while ICSANT criminalizes acts of nuclear sabotage and terrorism. The CNS and Vienna Declarations set important standards for the safe operation of nuclear power plants. Spent fuel and radioactive waste are similarly regulated by the Joint Convention. Both the early notification and assistance conventions are related to emergency preparedness and response. It places a duty on states to report nuclear accidents if there is a potential transboundary effect or release of radiation. And it also allows states to request assistance in the event of an accident. Finally, the liability conventions set out various rules and compensatory standards for civil and third-party liability. So having sort of surveyed these laws and treaties and conventions, I think the most interesting thing to me was that location matters more than technology type or technology size. So there are a few important implications and real-world applications for where this technology will be sited. There is a distinction between land-based, maritime, and transportable nuclear reactors. For example, the Convention on Nuclear Safety applies explicitly to land-based civil nuclear power reactors. Therefore, CNS would not cover floating plants like the academic Lomonosov, which was on one of the previous slides, even though Russia is a party to the Convention on Nuclear Safety. This restriction also has implications for transportable nuclear reactors. Will they be considered land-based and stationary once parked at a site? How will those protections cease when physically being transported? Another example, liability coverage varies depending on the location of the accident. If it's in international waters versus territorial waters, the legal jurisdiction is kind of blurry here. And this is really relevant, I think, especially in situations of territorial disputes. China right now is developing SMRs and hoping to place them in the South China Sea at the Sparkly Islands. Forgive me, I'm blanking on the name of that one, but Taiwan and Vietnam also claim territorial rights to these islands where China is hoping to place these reactors. So there's a bit of ambiguity on the legal clarity of what that means. Additionally, some states such as the US are considering using SMRs to power military bases. However, none of these conventions apply to nuclear technology used for military purposes, which presents potential consequences for civilians on and around these bases. If you take, for example, Elson Air Force Base in Alaska, has a population of 9,000 people. Roughly 7,000 of those are family members, civilians, contractors, and just people who work on the base. So there are a few important considerations. While these regimes are generally applicable to SMRs, I think it's really important to note a few caveats. So one, they're not universally adopted. Geopolitics, geographics, nuclear power program status all really have an effect on a state's decision-making process when they're considering whether or not to ratify or sign one of these treaties. There is also no legally binding enforcement mechanism. They all rely on voluntary compliance, peer reviews, and self-reporting. And finally, disparities in national resources really implement how states can bolster their security and safety standards, how they can live up to the standards set by these international regimes. So what's next? And these are quite broad, and I don't really see them so much as policy recommendations, but as food for thought for the folks of you in this room right now, of a few issues and areas that I think could use closer attention. How do we incentivize participation in international treaties and conventions, especially given the geopolitical state today, and considering how states like Russia and China are really fighting to export nuclear reactors, as Sarah will talk about very shortly? How do we incentivize participation? How do we get them to come to the table and sign these? Second, how do we increase capacity building and technical assistance programs to the states that might not have the human or financial resources that the UK or the US might have? Very excited to see panel 4 this afternoon talk about skills building. And lastly, how do we increase the legal clarity regarding maritime and transportable MPPs? I think these two are very interesting in terms of security and in terms of legal complications. And as we innovate technology, as we progress, I think it's also important to not put the cart in front of the horse, and we also need to make sure that we are innovating our legal frameworks and our regulatory processes along with technology. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Great talk, and keep those kind of prompts in mind for the Q&A that follows. There are 3 good summary points at the end. Our last speaker for this session, Sarah Sobalvarro, a recent graduate from the War Studies Department here at King's College here in London, where she earned a BA in International Relations. Her undergraduate dissertation feeds much of the content for this morning's talk around the state-led initiatives to market nuclear technology to non-nuclear countries. She's done a placement with the United States Department of State, where conducted open source intelligence and research on foreign nuclear technology programs, and has got interests through her current work on Generation 4 and dual-use technology deployments. So, welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And as Mackenzie said, I'm very excited to be here, so thank you all for your attendance. My name is Sarah. I recently obtained my BA in International Relations at the War Studies Department at King's. And right now I'm pursuing an MA in Security Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And I'm here today to talk about the security risks associated with commercial, state-led nuclear export programs. So, recent years have witnessed a resurgence of state-driven initiatives to market nuclear reactors to non-nuclear countries, as Mackenzie noticed. Many non-nuclear countries are interested in nuclear for the lower carbon emissions or the desalination use that some reactors offer. And countries such as the US, China, South Korea, and France have all been intent on marketing these reactors. Countries specifically like Russia and China have promoted a build-own-operate model of nuclear exportation, in which they finance most or all of the projects, they take on all associated risk with the project, they retain full ownership rights and revenue to the project, and the client then has to repay the supplier based on projected future income or future revenue. So today I'll be explaining why, in a world where the risk of dependency on Russian gas is heavily discussed, or dependency on foreign critical minerals, the risks of dependency on nuclear diplomacy is something that we should also all be taking into consideration. I will make my argument first by explaining why there's intense dependency in a client-state relationship for nuclear exports. This dependency then means that client states aren't able to operate their nuclear reactors without the help of the supplier, leading to a risk of supply disruption. And because of this, supplier states can then use this as leverage to extract concessions from client states, which poses a security risk for the strategic adversaries of supplying nations, like strategic adversaries of Russia or China. So I will be doing this by examining two case studies of a nuclear country importing a nuclear reactor or exporting a nuclear reactor to a non-nuclear country. The first is the example of the Akuyu nuclear power plant in Turkey, and the second is the example of the Endowment nuclear power plant in Egypt. And both these nuclear deals are made in agreement with Rosatom, which is a Russian state-led nuclear corporation. So, Russia, with the exception of China's exports to Pakistan, is the only country that's successfully been able to operate and construct a nuclear reactor in a foreign country in recent years. There's examples of Rosatom forming nuclear deals with Belarus, Bangladesh, and Iran, but Turkey and Egypt provide the most recent examples. It's one of the most successful nuclear diplomacy projects in history. As you can see, I have some facts on here, but just to highlight, before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there were 17 reactor units under construction in 7 separate countries, 509 nuclear cooperation agreements, and 228 memorandums of understanding and policy statements that had been formed with foreign countries between Rosatom. Russia employs what's called, if I can get this to work, a build-own-operate model. And I've already previously explained this, but the supplier will take on a majority or all of the project, retain full ownership rights and revenue, and assume all risk with the project. And the client state just has to repay the supplier based on projected revenue. This is obviously very attractive to client states because cost is one of the main issues that prevent states from actually investing in nuclear. And suppliers confront the costs and offer clients attractive interest rates. And additionally, Rosatom's in control of 38% of the world's uranium conversion and 46% of enrichment capacity. So they're able to carry out agreements where they're in charge of all fuel services and all decommissioning. So in these two case studies that I'm examining, Rosatom actually is in charge of all spent fuel handling, and all spent fuel is sent back to Russia for use in future reprocessing for future Russian nuclear endeavors. So first, it's important to assess how dependency exists in these two relationships. And I'm going to be doing this through 5 factors of dependency, as on the screen here. First, the electricity generated by the nuclear power plant in comparison to the total energy expenditure of the client state. The cost of constructing and operating the nuclear power plant for the client state versus the GDP of the client. All materials used and contained in these nuclear power plants, and the specialized knowledge of the domestic workforce of the client state. Lastly, I'll also be focusing on the lifespan of the reactors, not including decommissioning times. So beginning with electricity, the Akuyu nuclear power plant generates around 11.7% of Turkey's projected energy supply. The Endowment nuclear power plant is around 18.4. Cost, I have the figures up here. For fissile materials and all specialized materials, all materials for the plants, they're going to be procured and supplied by Russia. So this is particularly important, and I'll talk about this more, with specialized materials like instrumentation and control technologies. It's all coming from Rosatom. Specialized knowledge, all engineers and regulators who wish to work on these plants have to undergo specialized training programs in Russia beforehand and before they're actually able to work domestically. And for lifespan of the reactors, both reactors, or the types of reactors in both plants, are VVR-1200 reactors, although they're slightly different models. So for VVR-1200, you have a 10-year construction process roughly, 60-year operating life with an extension of 20 years, and altogether that places you at about 90 years, not including decommissioning. So this is a very long relationship between the client and the supplier. So Even if Russia left these agreements right now, client states would be in the precarious position of not being able to operate their reactors independently of the supplier. Turkey and Egypt do have established nuclear engineering programs, but their lack of domestic infrastructure means that while they understand the theoretical aspects of nuclear engineering, the practical experience required to build and operate large-scale plants isn't yet developed within their skilled workforce. Additionally, Turkey and Egypt don't possess uranium or the facilities for the domestic production of nuclear fuel for the specific fuel assemblies needed. Let me just go back, sorry about that, for the fuel assemblies needed in these power plants. And so the only VVR fuel assemblies that have been created outside of Rosatom or Russian client states have been with Westinghouse, but that's for a VVR 1000 reactor. So there's different fuel assemblies needed for a 1200. Unlike other energy systems like gas or solar, these client states can't get the parts they need for nuclear reactors from other states. This is more of an intense dependency than you'd see with Russian gas because the switching cost for these clients is very high compared to other technologies. Reactor parts are highly specialized. You can't substitute a reactor part from a different reactor. And the control and safety systems of these reactors are so intricate that if a client state wanted to reverse engineer them, it would take years and decades and a lot of extra cost. And so even if Turkey and Egypt had the workforce and they had adequate fuel for the VVR 1200 reactors after a Russian pullout, if something goes wrong with the plant, for example, if a coolant pump of the VVR reactor failed, then it's likely that the reactor would just have to be shut down entirely. So because these plants can't keep running without the help of the supplying state, then supplying states like Russia can use this as leverage to extract concessions from their clients. Although it's not predicted what would happen if Russia was trying to pressure a client state into acting in their favor, it's likely that they would take the plant offline or invoke an emergency shutdown. You can see this with the Bushehr nuclear power plant in Iran in June of 2021. So Iran's nuclear power plant, their sole nuclear power plant, was constructed under a build and operate agreement with Russia. And following the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, where US sanctions were reimposed on Iran, the Iranian government couldn't repay Rosatom per their agreement, and so the plant was taken offline, basically. And this was only an electricity loss of 1%, but it added to the already existing widespread blackouts in the region and substantially affected daily life. So when you're looking at Akuyu and Aldaba, which provide roughly 10 to 20% of their respective countries' energy supply, it's a highly concerning risk. In a non-extreme scenario, a supplier state could pressure a client state to vote in their favor in multilateral institutions or extract supplies and more favorable trade deals. In a more extreme scenario, a supplier state could pressure a client state to disrupt the operations of Western partners within their country. This risk is particularly significant with Turkey, which is a NATO member and hosts two crucial NATO bases, as you can see on the map that I've created on the right there. So first you have the Incirlik Air Base, which is NATO's largest nuclear weapons storage site and a key support hub for alliance missions. And you also have NATO's ballistic missile defense radar facility in Kerchak, right there. The build and operate contract places Russian assets and personnel in close proximity to these two NATO sites right here. And in a crisis situation, Russia could pressure Turkey to prohibit military flights from Incirlik or just shut down the Kerchak radar station completely. So obviously, this whole situation presents, very concerning risks. There's a couple things that Western nations should be doing, and there's some action in recent months that Western nations, such as the UK or the US, have actually been taking that follow in line with these recommendations. The first thing that would be crucial would be to develop sustainable alternatives to Russian-fueled nuclear fuel and technology. And recently, Western nations have been taking the approach of pairing enhanced sanctions against Rosatom with wider diplomatic efforts to encourage client states to move away from supplying nations that propose the build and operate agreement. A further step, though, some have argued that this doesn't go far enough. Further step would be for countries like the United States to fund American reactor export programs. Obviously, there's a huge risk of supplying nations, client states defaulting on their loans to supplying nations. However, the US has numerous financial tools that could help create a competitive commercial export program. And this would offset the billion-dollar equity investments that are being offered by the Russian government. So overall, this is a very important issue, and I think it's more intense of a dependency than other dependencies that you're seeing in the world today. These client states are locked into decades-long relationships with their supplying nation, and they are, it's a highly specialized technology, which means that the switching costs are very high for these client states to move away from their supplying nation. It's only going to persist with the resurgence in nuclear energy and, the global south's interest in, going into the nuclear field, so we should all be paying attention. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to address any questions moving forward.